So yeah, I first, before I begin, would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land in which I'm working and living today, the Bunurong and Wunurong people of the Great Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and the elders of other communities too, who may be here today. And I always just like to flag that as a migrant to Australia, I acknowledge the countless generations of First Nations people who have met, lived, and made creative work here before me, and that it's a legacy from which I and others continue to benefit. So that acknowledgement leads into my talk today on creative ecology's approach and how serendipity plays a role in that. Mainstream Australian culture sits rather uncomfortably between its Indigenous cultural origins, white colonial past, and contemporary Pacific Rim identity. What could be celebrated as a unique positioning in a melting pot of diverse cultural influences too often whitewashes itself in order to engage with American, British, and European creative and cultural industries. Sometimes in the process, we also fetishizing our Indigenous artists and outputs as our only unique calling card on the world stage. My current study explores the power of a creative ecology's approach for recognizing and celebrating the unique combination of elements in each site, in this case, city, that we're researching for this project. And those are Singapore, Hong Kong, Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. By looking at whole environments, including geopolitical conditions, creative and cultural industries, and higher education, amongst other factors, we in Australia, I'm arguing, might become more effective in working together with our closest regional neighbors. So I've been writing about the need for an ecological approach to creativity now for several years, but more recently, I'm incorporating the notion of the creative relational as a central part of any sustainable creative ecology. Whether talking about classrooms, workforces, regions, or collaborative relationships, understanding the relational aspects of creativity is a crucial way of making space for the other and enhancing deeper creative cooperation. I too work in an education context like Ron, but despite all the talk about 21st century skills and global workforces, a creative ecological and creative relational approach challenges educators and also employers, artists, and others to work outward from a creative interpersonal standpoint and into diverse disciplines and fields, rather than the pervasive individualist approaches which continue to dominate creativity studies in education. So my creative ecology model offers more than a commodified Floridian approach to artificially composing a so-called creative class or creative economy through what I feel is a jerry-rigging, site-specific diversity. And Florida's approach to predicting which cities or sites will perform as talent magnets, attracting what he calls high capital individuals, highlights the shackling mentality of seeing people as commodities, cities as markets, and culture as profit share. Now, Florida's 3 T's, technology, talent, and tolerance, also shows the way in which his approach, but also importantly others like him, misses the mark, in my view, not just critiques around his empirical claims, which we know are longstanding now, but in human terms, in which belonging and interdependence is really the goal of constructing lives worth living, not just simply tolerance. But like the persistence of the creative industry's discourse overall, his approach, his general approach remains creativity as an investment, hinging on capital and mind for scalability. My approach looks at the relationship between the elements and practices at any site, coming together in what might be understood, as we've been hearing today, as serendipity or serendipitous moments. It does still draw on Csikszentmihalyi's relationship between the individual and the field, and points to more recent work, though, arguing that more intense and sustainable creative experiences are grounded in collectivity rather than individualism or isolation. In other words, we need each other, creatively as well as otherwise, even when we are not directly collaborating, and particularly in sometimes serendipitous events or encounters. You might put it another way by drawing on actor network theory, one approach that acknowledges that everything in the social and natural worlds exist in relationship to one another. Within such networked ecologies, agency is manifest only in the relation of actors or actants to each other. Within this framing, material objects and non-human others also exert agency in a similar manner to humans. And some of my most recent research work, is moving into the area of post-human creativities. But in the Asian context, Chen and Zhang have extended recently, or this year, have extended creative entrepreneur literature by adopting or including the Guangxi network theory to explore the linkage of artistic creativity and entrepreneurial agility in regard to satisfaction and aspiration across the lifespan. Guangxi defines the fundamental dynamic in personalized social networks of power, in this case, and is a crucial system of beliefs in Chinese and more broadly Confucian cultures. Guangxi sees the individual as just part of a community or ecosystem in a set of family, hierarchical, work, and friendship relationships. Not only the what of these relationships, but the kinds of encounters of serendipity that that make them possible, and that in fact strengthen them. And we heard before about trust. That's a big part of it as well. In particular, there's a focus on tacit mutual commitments, reciprocity, as I said, trust, which are the grounds of Guangxi and Guangxi networks. Guangxi is also a powerful aspect of business practices in the Pacific Rim, also known in our region as the Bamboo Network. Like creative ecologies, Guangxi affirms the need to use specific approaches matched to our unique culture, time, and place, ourselves, and those relationships that emerge. And there is ample evidence showing that this approach makes for good business as well as good lives. Teresa Amabile and others have continued to urge us toward ecological measures of creativity most recently in workplace contexts, measures that look at the interaction between a person's creativity and their environment. Tools like her work environment inventory that assess workplace environmental factors like serendipity take these kind of ecological approaches, but remain pretty well shut out of educational measurement or creative capacity building in schools. My formulation of a creative ecology model includes 5 domains that address elements in all areas of learning or living communities. That's physical environment, processes, partnerships, policies, and products. But how might elements in an ecosystem still consider the magic of serendipity in creative encounters? Approaching creativity as an event occurring within an ecology engages all actors in practices stimulated by relationships and interactions within their micro, macro, and meta worlds. Creative thought results from the cognitive, physical, emotional, and virtual interactions between these people, problems, situations, and experiences triggered through affordances that allow such connectivity. That's drawing on Erica McWilliam. The creative ecologies approach recognizes how a site's people, practices, and places are intertwined and connected and interdependent, working in, out of, and through one another, creating the conditions for creativity to thrive, rather than mythical fixed individual attributes or achievement. These ecological connections and conditions enable and allow the serendipity that provides each entity within the ecosystem to thrive through interactions and flows, permeating barriers, discarding false binaries of inside and outside, individual and collective activities or achievements, and return instead to the encounter. So I leave you with an invitation to the kind of intercultural research engagements present in my current study. A white American researcher living in Australia explores shared and different creative thinking and practices within our region, and has to be willing to get it wrong, to go outside of my own environment, to be willing to engage in research work that does not make essentializing claims or representations, but rather lays the table, sets the table for creative serendipitous encounter. Working across cultures to celebrate the preciousness of site-specific creative practice, which emerge in these serendipitous encounters, is not only good for creativity, it's good for global sustainability and peace as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dan. I'm going to give you a round of applause here online that echo through the internet.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful. I think it's such an important discussion to be reminded of the positive and negative, if you want, uses of the word creativity in some ways, and the importance of how we think about it. You know, we often come either from a discourse of education or in organizations, and we sometimes romanticize the concept, but we have to think very carefully about what we mean by it and how we look at it. I think it always has deep consequences, you know, when we participate in something much bigger, when we do creativity research or serendipity research. Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, I don't want to talk too much because I love talking. Probably people figured that out by now. So we have about 5 minutes or so, or until 25, for questions. Does anyone want to? You can either write in the chat or just voice a question for Dan, or you can, I'm also going to monitor if someone raises the hand online. Because otherwise I will have questions. I warn you. I want to, yeah, go on then.
I'm interested in the relationship between the kind of field or the ecosystem and the notion of serendipity, and the idea being, I guess, like I was asking Ron in his talk about the, you know, I guess I've always approached my creativity research in terms of the event, and that it's beyond, kind of setting up or controlling or even teaching for that matter, but that we can make the conditions for it. And so I wonder if people feel any resonance with the idea that by attending to the field or the ecology, you might make the conditions for the serendipitous moments out of which creativity might emerge or might not, but generative serendipity.
Right. I mean, I'm gonna definitely, you know, whoever wants to talk, please raise their hand, and I think I'm gonna see it and give you the floor. But I wanted just to pick up on this idea of the ecology. You know, I'm also fascinated and obsessed with ecologies, and I have these 5 A's. Anyway, my personal way of kind of relating to it, and I'm always unsatisfied with it. For you, just to recap and maybe just to fill up this question with your approach. So, do you have one specific typology you follow for this? You've obviously introduced us to also the work of other people who have more systemic views. What do you include first and foremost in these creative ecologies?
Well, the way that I've sort of drawn up my own heuristic, which I do have kind of a model for, but I didn't make a slide for today. But I created it around secondary school context. But I guess one of the reasons I'm doing this regional research now is to see how it works at the city scale or at the region scale. Right. And the 5 elements in mine, I guess the 5 P's, not A's. Everybody's got a letter. The 4 C's. Mine are the physical environment. So whatever the physical environment is, including natural and built, processes, partnerships, policies, and products. Those are the 5 elements of my ecology. And I think in terms of schools, but as I say, scaling that up into cities and regions, I think I'm interested to see how we, at different points in that scaling up or down, how we sort of ignore the other elements in the ecology to the detriment of creating those conditions for creative engagement, and also the aspect of creativity in terms of difference rubbing against each other. So, for example, why do we sit as a nation in the Asia Pacific and look toward the white Western and Northern states for our creative economy validation and engagement? I mean, there are economic reasons for that, but also what might we do more of in this region to understand how we might be doing or thinking about creativity differently and invite others to us.
Excellent. Kate, I think, raised her hand. Kate, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was so interesting and insightful. And I wanted to ask you to define, if it's possible, what do you mean by products? Because it is the Western philosophy, the Western view of creativity that is concentrated on material side of creativity. So I wonder, do you include any ideas in those products, or you also concentrate on physical things created? Because it's for secondary school kids, and it's not always about making something, right? It's also, it's just my guess.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll just say briefly, it was a conscious effort to include practices and products both, because I think one of the longstanding sort of debates or tensions in education, creative education, research and practice is around measurement, of course, and nothing is prioritized or valued in educational environments, seemingly, unless it's measurable. And so once creativity started making its way in an articulate manner into curricula around the world, then the question of measurement emerges. And our measurement is focused on products, not processes. So I included both, but in terms of the looking at larger environments than just a classroom or the education sector, I'm interested in thinking about the ways in which relationships can also be considered products and so on. So part of my work has been about decommodifying understandings of creative output.
Great. Very interesting.
Right. And I also appreciate very much, Dan, how you always bring in the micro, meso, and macro somehow in the way you look at, including the products, right? And then all of these bigger forces around, kind of the use, definition, acknowledgement of products. Excellent. We have only 1 minute, but I think Alistair has a question, maybe a very quick question.
Yeah, it was how enjoy that. Thank you. And the ecological perspective is one that I've looked at before. But how do you fit in, apart from it not being a P, the dreadful W issue, where everything is, particularly in education, is oriented towards work preparation and how that acts as a major factor. And then also moving into, if you like, the city area, the economy, the economic dimension, because it's always struck me that creativity is dependent in large part on there being a sufficiently cheap part of town for lots of people to live in and bounce off each other. And that's predominantly an economic factor. And I'm not sure where that fitted into your 5 Ps.
Yeah, thanks. The speed answer is, I guess, I wrote a book in 2014 called The Creative Turn, which was sort of problematizing the commodification of creativity, that all things creative must now be profitable. And I think, but at the same time, creative work, creative labor has never been outside of economic concerns or market concerns. I mean, from Michelangelo all the way to us. I mean, I think it's a myth that, somehow it sits outside of, or we as subjects, social subjects, sit outside of economies or economic concerns. And I think that's one of the great hypocrisies of compulsory education at the moment is that, you know, we're saying we are determined by workforce needs and flows, but at the same time we won't fully acknowledge that. We like to talk about educating the whole person, but then the curriculum and the timetable is dominated by market concerns, which currently seem to be centered around STEM in most parts of the world. So if we really were going to admit that we were driven in education by market concerns, just to at least a large degree, then we would prioritize creativity in the curriculum, because certainly industry is now all saying they want it and we're educating insufficiently for it. I think that's an interesting disconnect there, but it's a further conversation. But thank you, Vlad, for having me today.
Of course, and the pleasure is all ours. And I think this is a wonderful bridge maybe to Alistair's own presentation around education, PhD research. So